Mr. Mark, an American man, once believed he had a happy family in Vietnam, complete with three adorable children, but with just one click on an email containing the results of a DNA test, his entire world collapsed. Not one, but all three children turned out not to be biologically his. Shock, rage, absolute disbelief. Behind a long-standing marriage lay a secret he could have never imagined. The three children he had lovingly raised were actually the result of his Vietnamese wife's affairs. What happened? Why did she do it? And what did Mr. Mark decide to do after the horrifying truth came to light? When Mr. Mark left Vietnam in early May 2023, he had no idea that trip back to the US would mark the beginning of the most bitter chapter in his life. He was an American man in his 50s, married to a Vietnamese woman for nearly 10 years. Together they had three sons, adorable, well-mannered boys who always called him Dad with pride. He once believed that, even though the marriage wasn't perfect, he had the most precious thing in life: a family, a home, and three children he loved more than himself. But just a few weeks earlier, a question had begun to echo in his mind every time he looked at their faces, especially his eldest son, who was nearly 9. Why, doesn't this child look anything like me? At first, he blamed himself for overthinking. After all, the kids were raised in a multicultural household, lived mostly in Vietnam, and maybe the Asian genes were just dominant. But the doubt wouldn't leave him alone. The second child didn't look like him either. Not the eye color, the skin tone, the gait, or even his gestures. And the youngest, the one he thought looked most like me, only deepened his confusion when he compared childhood photos and couldn't find a single similarity. Finally, he did the thing he had hesitated to do for months: a DNA test. One morning in early May, he visited the Center for DNA Analysis and Genetic Technology in Hanoi. It was a discreet appointment. He told no one, not even his wife. He brought 2 DNA samples from his older children, collected from toothbrushes and fingernail clippings, just as the staff had instructed. He didn't have time to wait. He had to return to the US later that afternoon, so he left his email and asked for the results to be sent directly. 2 days later, sitting in his office in Florida, he received the email from the center. At first, he hesitated to open it, but curiosity, mixed with dread, pushed him to click the attached PDF. And then, his world collapsed. Both children, whom he had held, fed, raised since birth, had no biological connection to him. No words could describe the way he felt. His heart stopped. A cold wave rushed through his body. He sat frozen for hours, staring at the results, where one line was bold and clear: no father-child relationship. He couldn't breathe. Years of love, care, financial support, from sending money every month to raise the kids in Vietnam, to enduring long-haul flights just to see them for a few weeks each year. Was it all just a lie? Unable to accept the reality, he called the center again, requesting a Vietnamese translation of the report. He was planning to return to Vietnam for one last confirmation. A month later, he came back to Hanoi. This time, he brought the youngest child, the one he still hoped might be his. His eyes were heavy, his face more gaunt than before. Accompanying him was a Vietnamese attorney he had appointed to ensure everything was done legally and transparently. Another DNA sample was taken, another long, anxious wait, and then the third result was handed directly to him. This time there was no email. He read it on the spot. And right there in that very room, all hope was lost. The youngest child wasn't biologically his either. 3 children, not one of them his by blood. Mr. Mark buried his head in his hands, collapsing onto the desk. According to the center's director, Ms. Nguyen Thi Nga, he clawed at his hair, face pale, eyes brimming with tears. This wasn't just the grief of a father. It was the anguish of a man utterly betrayed, who had given his all for his family, out of duty, out of love, even if that love had never been whole. He didn't say another word, but his eyes, said everything. Everyone at the center could sense it. He was no longer the same man. In just over a month, Mr. Mark went from believing he had 3 children on the other side of the world to facing the brutal truth. None of them shared his blood, and even more painfully, as their legal father, he had been kept in the dark for all those years. On the way out of the DNA testing center in Hanoi, Mr. Mark couldn't take another step. His heart felt as if it had been crushed under the weight of unbearable pain. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. There was only a haunting silence, one far more terrifying than any outburst of anger. The woman walking beside him, a lawyer, knew he was on the edge of collapse. A few hours later, back at the hotel, Mr. Mark locked his door and refused to see anyone. The next day, he called the lawyer and spoke only one sentence. "Let's start the divorce paperwork as soon as possible." A marriage that once seemed to have weathered time now lay shattered beyond repair. All the things he had tried so hard to overlook, the distance, the language barrier, the cultural differences, were now just surface wounds. What he could never forgive was the years of deceit. He had unknowingly lived a role, playing father to children that were never his, while the woman he called wife had hidden a devastating truth. As the lawyer began preparing the documents, Mr. Mark, like a wounded soldier returning from the battlefield, sat and relived every memory that had once brought him joy, but now pierced his heart like a blade. He remembered the day his first child was born. He cried hearing the baby's first cries over the phone from Vietnam. He remembered when the youngest struggled to say his first words in English, calling him Daddy over a video call. He remembered all the early mornings and late nights he stayed awake just to talk to his kids through a screen. He remembered last year's Tet holiday, how he flew back, brought gifts for each of them, took them to the park, took family photos, and now each of those snapshots had become evidence of an emotional fraud. Mr. Mark was not a weak man. With over 2 decades in the mechanical engineering industry, he was logical, steady, and deeply responsible. And perhaps that's exactly why this betrayal broke him so deeply. He couldn't forgive his wife. And even worse, he couldn't forgive himself for trusting too much. A week later, he arranged a private meeting with his Vietnamese wife. At a small coffee shop near West Lake, he didn't waste time. He placed copies of the DNA results for all 3 children on the table and looked her straight in the eyes. "I know everything." She didn't deny it. Her face seemed prepared for this moment. She was silent for a long time, then finally spoke in a soft voice Mr. Mark had not heard in years. "I'm sorry." But that apology could never patch the betrayal. It could never undo the near decade he had lived as a father, when he had, in truth, always been an outsider. Mr. Mark asked only one question. "Why did you do this to me? To the kids?" Her answer hurt even more. "I didn't think you'd ever find out, and I didn't want to ruin things. You were a good husband, a good father." She didn't deny, she didn't defend, she simply admitted their marriage had never been built on love. It was a transaction. He brought financial stability. She played the role of a wife, for appearances, and as physical distance and language drifted them further apart, the Vietnamese man from her past, an old lover from before the marriage, became her emotional and physical anchor. Whenever Mr. Mark flew back to the U.S., she returned to that relationship. So much so that all 3 children were born from that affair. Yet Mr. Mark had loved and raised them, never once suspecting a thing. After that conversation, Mr. Mark stopped asking questions. There was no need for blame, no need for further explanations or crocodile tears. What he needed now was freedom. The divorce papers were filed within that same week. Mr. Mark agreed to relinquish all custody rights because, simply put, they weren't his children. He also agreed to transfer all assets in Vietnam, the house, the car, even a savings account he had once opened for the kids. If his ex-wife would sign the divorce quickly and quietly. Someone once asked him, "Did you ever truly love her?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes, sorrowful and hollow, said it all. You don't break this hard unless you loved deeply. You don't fall this fast unless you believed completely. And so, just over a month after the truth came to light, Mr. Mark finalized his divorce. No hesitation, no second thoughts, no looking back. He returned to America carrying with him 3 DNA test results and a vast emptiness in his soul. Since that day, he has had no contact with his ex-wife or the 3 children, not out of hatred, but because he knows he must first heal himself from the greatest heartbreak of his life. After the divorce, Mr. Mark left Vietnam, carrying with him not just the wounds of a broken marriage, but also a heavy silence, choking and unnamed. Though he had cut off all contact, he still found himself now and then staring at photos of the 3 children, wondering, do they know I'm not their biological father? Did they ever sense any difference in the way I loved them? But then, like many who've been betrayed, he taught himself how to sever emotional ties. Not because he wanted to forget, but because remembering no longer served a purpose. Meanwhile, back in Vietnam, the story was far from over. An unexpected twist, like a sequel no one saw coming, quietly unfolded just 2 months after Mr. Mark finalized his painful divorce. In July 2023, at the very same DNA testing center where Mr. Mark had once shown up 3 times, a woman in her 40s arrived, accompanied by 3 children. Strangely, uncannily, the children's names and birth dates matched exactly with those who had once been tested alongside Mr. Mark. The technicians at the center were stunned as they cross-checked the records. They instantly recognized the children, faces they couldn't forget from the day they had to deliver results proving no biological connection to the American man. And yet, here they were again, this time with a different man. This man was Vietnamese, quiet, modestly dressed, reserved. According to the woman, she was here to settle something once and for all. A DNA test between the 3 children and the man beside her, to confirm if he was their biological father. The air in the waiting room turned thick. The staff, seasoned professionals who had handled thousands of cases, had never encountered anything quite like this. They carried out their tasks silently, collecting samples, asking no unnecessary questions, but their eyes said everything. There was something unmistakable about the way the children interacted with this man. The youngest clung to his hand and wouldn't let go. The eldest occasionally glanced at him and smiled softly. The middle child, shyer, stood beside him like it was the safest place in the world. No words were needed. Everyone present sensed the truth. This relationship didn't begin today. Days later, the results came in. All 3 children were confirmed to be the biological children of the Vietnamese man. The results didn't carry the same shock as before, but they did complete a long-fractured truth. The half that Mr. Mark once believed in was now filled in by the other half. The woman, Mr. Mark's ex-wife, no longer denied anything. This time she spoke to the staff at the DNA center with clarity and directness. I'm the one who brought these children here with my ex-husband, the American. Now I am here to confirm the truth so I can begin again with their real father. There was no anger or bitterness in her voice. It felt more like a release, as if after years of living in pieces, she had finally chosen a path of honesty. She shared that her marriage with Mr. Mark had never been built on love. It was a union of necessity. She needed stability, and he longed for a family in his 40s. But cultural differences, language barriers, and emotional distance quickly turned their marriage into a gilded cage. Eventually, she reconnected with the man from her youth, the one she had deeply loved but couldn't be with due to life's circumstances. They saw each other whenever Mr. Mark left Vietnam. She confided in him in ways she never could with her foreign husband. Gradually, that secret relationship became a shadow family. The 3 children were born during periods when Mr. Mark was frequently away. She admitted she had always known who their real father was, but never had the courage to speak the truth. Part of it was fear of losing the economic security she had. Another part was simply believing that Mr. Mark would never find out. But he did, and the lies unraveled. There was no turning back. Now, post-divorce, she has chosen to end the double life and be with the Vietnamese man, the true father of her children. She said, "I want my kids to grow up with their real father, someone who truly loves them, not in lies, not in a role someone else wrote." Some may judge her. Some may call her selfish, unfaithful, irresponsible. But from the perspective of a mother, she chose to do what's right for her children. Even if it's late, it's better than never. At last, the truth came to light. The real father stepped into the sun, and the man who unknowingly played that role for years, though heartbroken, was freed from the mask the marriage forced upon him. The children finally were given their true origin story. After the second DNA test confirmed that all three children were biologically fathered by the Vietnamese man, the woman had nothing left to hide. But the truth, what people assumed she had deliberately kept secret, was not just a simple case of betrayal. It was a long chain of wrong decisions, years of emotional torment, and, ultimately, a delayed choice named freedom. Her name is Hong. She was born in a rural village in northern Vietnam, the eldest daughter in a poor family with many siblings. From a young age, Hong learned how to endure, how to sacrifice, how to shoulder burdens. But deep down, she had a silent dream to escape poverty, to break free from the suffocating grip of her small hometown, and to live in a place of abundance where she would no longer have to beg for every coin or every meal. And then came Mr. Mark. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't young. He barely spoke Vietnamese, but he was kind, polite, and most of all, stable. At the time, Hong already had a boyfriend, the Vietnamese man she would later return to, but they couldn't marry. He had no stable job, no means to give her a life of comfort. In that period of uncertainty, Mr. Mark, a foreigner working in Vietnam on a joint venture project, noticed Hong during a dinner gathering at a small restaurant. They talked through an interpreter. Slowly, they grew close. When Mr. Mark proposed marriage, Hong stayed silent for a long time. And then she said yes, not out of love, but out of calculation. I knew I was being selfish, but at the time I didn't think I had any other choice if I wanted to help my family and escape poverty. She married a foreigner, and as her neighbors would say, she had struck gold. But no one knew what was hidden behind that golden shell of a marriage. Right after the wedding, Hong had to learn how to live like an American wife, tidy, punctual, organized, emotionally reserved, and fiercely independent. She didn't fully understand what her husband said, couldn't express her emotions completely, and never truly felt a soulful connection. As for Mr. Mark, although he was kind, he was also rigid, tightly managed finances, and constantly demanded that she be mature, independent, words that to Hong felt cold and lonely. The distance between them didn't shrink, it grew wider by the day. She began to feel lost, suffocated, especially every time Mr. Mark returned to the US. And then, during one lonely stretch, she reached out to her former lover. That man, his name was Long, had never married. He still lived in their hometown, worked as a mechanic, and had never forgotten Hong. They reunited like two unfinished stories that were missing a final chapter. But the first hug, the first secret handhold, turned into something that never ended. I'm not making excuses. I know I was wrong, but when I was with him, I felt like myself. I could breathe. Every time Mr. Mark came back, she returned to her role as a dutiful wife, a model mother. Every time he left, she lived another life, one that included Long and the three children. The cruel part was she never dared tell Mark that the children weren't his. Not because she wanted to deceive him for personal gain, but because she truly didn't know what to do with that truth. Confessing would destroy everything. Hiding meant living in guilt. Between those crossroads, she chose to move forward, hoping one day it would all just pass. But fate doesn't let you live in lies forever. When Mr. Mark requested a DNA test, she knew the day had come. She still prayed, still hoped he wouldn't go through with it. But when the divorce papers arrived, she understood. The game was over. And then she had to face it all. Face who she really was. Face Long, the man who never left, who quietly waited in the shadows for all those years. Face the three children, his flesh and blood, but raised in the arms of another man. After countless tears, she made a decision. Not to run anymore. I've lived the wrong way for too long. Now I just want to live right, even if it means starting from zero. She took the three children to a DNA center and tested them with Long. When the results confirmed all three were his biological children, she held his hand and said the words she had never dared say in her entire life. I'm sorry, and I want to make it up to you, to our children, if you'll still give me a chance. Long didn't blame her. He simply embraced her, then turned to the kids with tears in his eyes. For the first time, he was called Dad. Not in secret, not in shame, but in the light. Now Hong is no longer the wife of an American man. She's a single mother remarried to the true father of her children. Life no longer promises wealth, but for the first time she feels free. Feels like she's living in truth. Because in the end, after all the storms, she finally chose what was right. Honesty, real love, and a family that no longer has to hide. In another corner of the world, more than 8,000 miles away from Hanoi, Mr. Mark sat quietly in his small apartment in Florida. The cup of tea in his hands had long gone cold, but he hadn't taken a single sip. On the table in front of him lay 3 DNA test results, carefully laminated. Each sheet, covered in cold, clinical words, had once made his heart clench as if it would explode. But now he no longer trembled when he looked at them. He had weathered the storm. After leaving Vietnam, Mr. Mark made the decision never to return. Everything he had built there, from the house in the suburbs to the regular money transfers, even the framed photos on the walls, he left behind like a past that needed to be buried. But there was one thing he couldn't leave behind: the feeling of betrayal. In the early days after the divorce, he lived like a shadow. He didn't work, didn't see anyone, and even considered moving to a completely foreign country, one where no one would know he had been the man deceived in what seemed like an ideal international marriage. But the one thing that kept him from falling apart was this: the truth. As painful as it was, the truth allowed him to finally cut through the illusions he had been living in for nearly a decade. And it was thanks to a DNA test, something seemingly dry and scientific, that he finally got closure to a chapter of life filled with fog and fabrication. He used to think, if I hadn't taken the test, maybe I'd still be living a lie. Still believing those 3 children were mine, still wiring money, still video calling every week, all for a fatherhood that wasn't even real. But what's the difference between living in a lie and living in hell? It was the knowledge of the truth, even the brutal kind, that set Mr. Mark free. Many people think DNA tests are just for verifying blood ties, but to him, it was a journey of finding himself again. A painful journey, but a necessary one. In a rare conversation with Ms. Nguyen Thi Zunga, director of the Hanoi DNA Analysis Center, he once said something she would never forget. Thank you for helping me break the illusion. Because without it, I would have died in a family that wasn't real, playing the role of a father to children who weren't mine. Mr. Mark doesn't hate his ex-wife. Hatred only twists the soul. He understands. Everyone in the story had their reasons, however terrible they were. But what brought him peace was this. In the end, the children, though not his, found their way back to their biological father. He had been a pretend dad for 9 years, but that made him realize love alone doesn't create blood ties, and blood ties don't automatically create love. That's why he holds no resentment toward the children. They weren't at fault. He had once cherished them, taught them how to read English, how to speak kindly, how to hug someone with a full heart. And he believes that whether or not he was their biological father, he left behind in their hearts the memory of a good man, a real father figure. A few months later, Mr. Mark slowly returned to work. He joined a support group for people who had experienced betrayal in cross cultural marriages. He shared his story, not to seek pity, but to help others see that sometimes science is the only escape from the prison of emotion. He once told a friend in the group, I used to live in the illusion that I had a family, that I had children, but the truth is I was just playing a role in a script I never wrote. The DNA test was like a director walking in and saying, cut, your part's over. So I stepped off stage and started writing a new script, one of my own. Since then, he's taken part in awareness campaigns about DNA testing, not to encourage suspicion, but to encourage people to face the truth, even the painful kind, in order to free themselves. Mr. Mark is no longer a victim, he's a survivor, and the DNA test, once just a cold string of numbers, was the very thing that rescued him from a false life. It brought him back to being a real man, living a real life, and loving himself the way he always deserved.